When you watch the mainstream media news, do you feel a little twitch? Is there a tingle in your left hand? Is your jaw locked? We have the solution. Welcome to Reasonable Arguments, the podcast where thoughtful debate meets unfiltered fun. Coming to you from Sarasota, Florida, where your hosts, Jamie Miller and Jennifer Bash, make sense of the chaos. Together, we mix informed conservative commentary, playful banter, and just the right amount of nonsense to keep it entertaining. This is Reasonable Arguments, and now your hosts, husband and wife duo, Jamie and Jennifer.
Hello.
Hey there, another great episode in store today. Who do we have, Jennifer?
We do. Today we have Dan Stein, who is a longtime former president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, also known as FAIR. He has been one of the most influential voices in the national immigration debate for over 4 decades. Dan joined FAIR back in 1982 and led the organization for over 20 years and has testified before Congress more than 50 times. His work focuses on the legal, economic, and social impacts of immigration, especially what happens when it's not well regulated. FAIR pushes for policies that prioritize national interest, secure borders, and sustainable growth. So let's welcome Dan to the show. Hello, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be with you.
So one of the questions that we found interesting when we asked it from our other guest was, how did you get into immigration?
Well, back in the 1970s, I was working for Congress on international drug control policy and became very interested in international development programs in Latin America, crop substitution programs, particularly eradication programs for coca crops and marijuana. And over time, it became clear to me that a lot of these petty despots in Latin America were using out-migration as a way of avoiding internal political and economic reform. And so it became clear that border security was a key part of advancing U.S. foreign policy in terms of bringing about positive political change back in the home countries. So I went to work for FAIR to work on what I thought would be one of the most important issues over the next 40 years, as it turned out to be, immigration. And in all this time, nothing has changed my mind about A, the importance of the issue, and B, the fact that the way we practice immigration policy often runs contrary to our U.S. foreign policy interests globally. And so after about 43 years at FAIR, I decided about 3 weeks ago to retire. But you know me, I'm always going to be in the mix on this thing because immigration is going to be a major part of the political debate for the next 100 years.
Well, so we have a list of questions for you, but we're happy to go in any direction. But I really am interested in kind of, you have a unique perspective. You're the fourth person we've had in a 4-part series. We may add a fifth, which would be our local sheriff and how immigration is impacting us here in Sarasota County. But from a national stage, you're the fourth person, and you kind of have a unique perspective of, helping others versus protecting ourselves. And so there's a lot of people trying to escape dangerous places around the world. And how do we help those folks without putting our own country at risk or for us becoming stretched too thin?
Well, the U.S. can't be the home of last resort for all the world's displeased and dispossessed. And the fact is that there's an international obligation of all community of nations to try to provide succor and support for people who are in truly life-threatening situations. And because the U.S. has advanced several concepts of freedom and market capitalism and other things, we've seen a tremendous advance in the average incomes of people all over the world beyond anything that was ever anticipated 50 years ago. 50 years ago, there was enormous catastrophizing about worldwide famine and about die-offs and everything else because of projections about agricultural production and things like that, as well as the success of market capitalism has been able to produce standards of living that far exceeded anybody's projections back then. But the reality is there's still about 3 billion more people on the planet now than when I started working on the issue. And so there are hundreds of millions of people who have everything to gain and nothing to lose by trying to get into a handful of countries that have a strong social safety net and have essentially an actuarial income stream because of that social safety net that dwarfs anything like their standard of living back in the home country. So trying to find those people who are truly, political refugees, people who are fearing for their lives for political reasons, or people whose lives are in some kind of danger because of those activities, versus people who simply want to improve themselves economically by making a move, is like finding a needle in a haystack. And our country, like all other countries that enjoy Western democratic traditions, has an effort to try to provide the procedural process that's due to make sure we get the facts, to figure out who's entitled to protection and who isn't. And then once you get that protection, then you ultimately have to make sure it's temporary, right? Not permanent, because there's so many who would theoretically qualify, while ensuring there's a fair share responsibility globally, while at the same time realizing that not everybody's going to be able to move, and that the ultimate solutions, of course, would be temporary resettlement near the home country with ultimate repatriation when it's safe to do so, while advancing ideas that bring about democratic capitalism, market capitalism under a democracy, self-governing republic that has proven to be so successful so far in this country.
Okay.
In other words, it's like a global rule, a golden rule for the global village, right? We would want to treat people who come to our shores the way we would want our people treated elsewhere, right? And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of countries are not so hospitable. The US over the last 50, 60 years can take its place next to anybody for its generosity and tradition. Think about the numbers of people this country has absorbed and assimilated over the last 50, 100 years from all over the world. One of this engine of assimilation that somehow digested, as Israel Zangwill said 100 and some years ago, to create a nation of immigrants, somehow a melting pot out of so many different traditions to assimilate them into one common language and cultural tradition. Quite amazing.
Well, and I think what you said is, and that's kind of the first time that I've heard that, is where, actually vetting people before they come in. So, are you in a situation where, you're not safe or whatever it is, then we can make that determination and bring you in. But obviously that is not what has happened, especially over the past 4 years with how many people that have crossed the border and not for those reasons, I'm sure. So I think that's a great idea to, okay, let's talk about it and tell us why you need to be here and let us make that decision, I guess.
Well, right. I mean, in the end, a successful immigration system allows in the people who should be here and keeps out the ones who don't. And unfortunately, the politics of this country are pretty much broken at this point. You see this hardened um polarization like we've hardly ever seen before, not since before the Civil War, really. Why it is, of course, a big topic of discussion. It's beyond the scope here. But in the course of working on one issue for so many years and working with so many amazing and intelligent, bright people who had a lot of foresight, people who founded FAIR back in 1979, 78, they were amazing men and women who were thinking about the issue going on 40, 50 years from now, recognizing that there was a strong bipartisan consensus that the rule of law was a cornerstone of citizenship and that secure borders are the definition of modern nationhood. And that if you lose control of your borders, as Ronald Reagan said, you're not a country. And most other countries around the world understand, basically, that if you lose control of your borders, you're not a country. Well, the Democratic Party throughout most of the 20th century was anchored by a strong commitment to organized labor, from Sam Gompers, founder of organized labor, all the way through about 1995. The Democratic Party was wedded to this strong unionized labor tradition and stood for very strong border security. Everybody in the 1960s, 70s, illegal means, hey, illegal, right? You cross the border illegally, you're jumping in line. That's contrary to the American value system. Cheaters don't prosper. You don't break the law to get ahead of the line. That's not the American way. Fairness is still very much an American concept. And we basically believe in that. So when Ronald Reagan signed the 1986 bill that had an amnesty, everybody from Chuck Schumer, I know Chuck's lying when his mouth is moving, all the way to Ronald Reagan. This is the last amnesty we're going to do, right? Because in the end, as I say, respect for law is what matters. That bill was supposed to get control of the borders. And of course, it did not. And there's a lot of reasons why. But the immigration issue is ultimately motivated by greed, um, intolerance, exploitation. I mean, much of the debates about everything from slavery all the way through modern labor contracting and guest worker programs is about the conditions under which labor is brought into this country from other countries. And this is ultimately, getting a little far afield here, but the bottom line is for the average American here, you don't see the consensus about the rule of law animating the discussion because the Democrats, and I'm not just picking on them, the Republicans have issues too, but the Democrats abandoned their commitment to the treatment of the average American worker. When Bill Clinton and others signed these trade agreements that outsourced all this manufacturing, the Democrats lost this manufacturing base. Blue collar Democrats became Reagan Democrats, and they had to find a new constituency. And in a great book by David Horowitz called The Shadow Party, 2005, described how George Soros and the radical left were taking over the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party had to create a new constituency, which turned out to be this mosaic of identity politics. And they decided that immigrants represented this emerging minority that they could exploit. Started really under Obama, second term, but then Joe Biden took it downtown with this complete destruction of American border control. And even now you see it with Chris Von Hollen, my senator, and Jamie Raskin, my representative. I'm going to kill myself. Basically, they're flying down there to bring back an MS-13 gangbanger because they feel he was wrongly deported, even though he'd had his day in court twice, thumbed his nose at our legal system, and had absolutely no right to be here. So, I mean, the Democrats have gone full on crazy, lunatic. And suddenly it's like illegal doesn't mean anything. Citizenship doesn't mean anything. There's no longer any sort of consensus about what the rule of law matters in immigration policy. And you wonder, it all started with Obama under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. No legislation is going to get through Congress when the Democratic Party doesn't see any value, if you will, in working to restore a functioning immigration system. They want chaos. The organizations that have attacked FAIR over the last 30 years, like the SPLC you mentioned, Jennifer, are basically, and the ACLU, look at what they want. If you want to know what those organizations want, it is what you saw under Joe Biden. Chaos, anarchy, collapse of the rule of law, millions and millions of aliens bust into the country, no vetting, terrorists, terrorist watch list, murderers, criminals. They don't care. They don't care what the costs are to taxpayers, education, housing, healthcare. They don't care. Okay? All they want to do is re-engineer the American electorate, as Elon Musk said, to their political advantage. So now that we've all seen it, nobody supports it.
So, that's gonna that's the point we're trying to understand. So, is it about votes? Is it about cheap labor? Is it about just the whole
about
thing?
both?
Yeah.
I mean, a great environmental writer, Edward Abbey, said, conservatives have their cheap labor, liberals have their cheap votes. The business community, in particular, big agriculture, has been the raspberry seed in our wisdom tooth for decades. They always want some kind of snap your fingers, and Jose and a bunch of guys in the back of a pickup show up to pick strawberries. Of course, the Japanese and the Netherlands, they would have automated this stuff a long time ago. But every time we talk about border security, they come to Congress and go, oh, we got to have a guest worker program. The guest worker program that they're demanding is totally unworkable. So what they really want is a continued flow of illegal labor, which is very costly because they work in the fields for a while, then they go to the cities, then they bring their families, and then they have to be replaced with more, and it's just continuing streams like a stepping stone. But they're very powerful in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party. And then on the left, yes, there are books you can read. I mean, the Democratic operatives have written. They're flat out saying, oh, we have a lock on people of color. We want to replicate with the Hispanic community the kind of political loyalty we've seen from the African American community. and just basically run roughshod over the pre-1970 American descendant of immigrant stock that's here because they're so loyal. Well, Donald Trump has demonstrated there's a few flaws in the theory. And in fact, Biden was so irresponsible. I mean, I think the country would have been better off if Biden had been alive while he was president. But anyway, I'm just kidding around here.
Yeah.
But
No,
the point is that Trump took advantage of the incredible, colossal political mistakes that, frankly, Hillary Clinton made in 2016 too, which is somewhere along the way, Barack Obama has not been able to convince his so-called successors that abolishing borders is something neither party's base really supports. But it gave Trump an enormous opportunity. And but the most interesting thing about it is the Democrats seem to have learned absolutely nothing from the mistakes that they're making. They're just doubling down.
Well, and it seems like an issue where, they're cutting off their nose to spite their face, because what we're seeing, in a diverse state like Florida, especially down in Miami and Southeast Florida, prior to Barack Obama, we started to see this generational shift of African Americans to the Republican Party. Barack Obama certainly stopped that, and for that period of time, but now we're starting to see that shift again. And certainly in, for instance, the Cuban community has been Republican, but you started looking at other South American, Central American communities where they came and voted Democrat. The Puerto Rican community voted Democrat. And now we're seeing, as they're here generationally, they're voting more and more Republican. And, so it's one of these things that where Democrats are really short-sighted. Not only are they put it compromising the safety and integrity of the very fabric of our country, but they are, the long term is these folks aren't going to vote for them anyway, because once they become economically involved in America, they know that their only chance for true economic freedom is what Republicans stand for, not what Democrats stand for. And so it's just, I just keep going. It's just a frustrating hypocrisy that the Democrats continue to portray. But it starts with our children in a way, and so a lot of this impacts people starting out in their careers and jobs for young Americans. And so what kind of information have you seen where this is truly impacting kind of starting people starting out in their careers, starting out in life, or even teenagers looking for jobs?
Oh, well, I mean, this is a huge topic, but you have to go back to the late 1980s and the dawn of the computer industry with mass production of laptops and things like that. And they went to Congress and they said, "Oh, we need temporary skilled workers because there aren't enough Americans to do this job." And they pushed Congress to create the H-1B program. And this thing has now gone on for the so-called shortage has gone on for decades. Because once they get addicted to a foreign labor flow, it drives out American workers. I mean, de Tocqueville, when he was writing Democracy in America, pointed out that slave labor and free labor can't coexist in the same labor market for the same basic reason. Guest workers drive out American workers because their expectations are skewed in a whole bunch of ways, including their exploitable status. But then we signed all these agreements where we outsourced millions and millions of manufacturing jobs. And the theory was back then that we were going to be the knowledge dominant society. And J.D. Vance made this really important speech to the Innovation Society a few weeks ago, explaining how these assumptions turned out to be wrong. The belief was back then that we could send manufacturing overseas, but retain R&D, research and development, and design, computer-aided design, manufacturing, high value-added manufacturing here. And the problem was that none of them anticipated the advent of the internet and its utility worldwide in moving knowledge work around the world. At the same time, the country lost control of its borders. And so all the assumptions that were in play in the early 1990s about what kind of economy we were going to have, high value-added manufacturing, knowledge work, service work, Americans were going to be, trained in all this knowledge work, great education, relatively few people in schools because the birth rate had declined in the 70s, not taking any factor of immigration into account. and that for those jobs that were in the non-export competing sector, like, janitorial work, service work, hotel, restaurant, they would be well-paid unionized jobs. And that was what the American people were sold. None of that happened. Instead, foreign workers were brought in. They started basically stealing technology, taking it back home. Companies started outsourcing smart work, knowledge work overseas. And now Americans are suddenly competing in a worldwide labor force. And naturally, there are all these. I mean, you just look at manufacturing. Trump thinks we're going to be able to compete in manufacturing with countries like China, but their pay scale is so dramatically different. It's going to be kind of a challenge to do that. Well, young Americans today basically are being told, well, you're not good enough to do any job in your own country. There are always foreign workers out there who are going to bring in these skills and do them better. So between that and the population growth that's resulted from immigration, crowding out housing, bidding up housing costs, supply stock isn't there. I mean, young people today can't get a leg up. They can't achieve economic security for family formation. And as a result, they don't have the economic security to even start families. And yeah, women want to be in the workforce, but at the same time, they can't function on one income. And to be able to step out of the labor force with young children is not affordable for families. So the women are waiting longer and longer. And then by the time they're ready to have kids, it's much more difficult. Maybe they'll have one or two, but you see the decline in fertility where it's sub-replacement fertility now. And all these factors play into the fact that there's this congestion effect of both massive immigration and outsourcing at the same time. So you wonder why there's, like, at a time when there should be a strong economic future for our young people today, they don't see anything being actually built in this country. There's no real manufacturing going on. It doesn't fire their imaginations. And B, the conventional path toward college with its enormous debt isn't really guaranteeing the skills to do the kinds of jobs that needed to be done in this country in the future. I mean, I got a grandson. He's smart as a whip. I don't see any effort. He's in what, sixth, seventh grade? I don't see any effort by these tech companies to go out there and recruit people like him and get him channeled into the right path forward to the jobs that are needed tomorrow, because they still believe they can rake off people from India and China to do these works. And then they go to Congress and go, oh, we can't get Americans to do the job. Well, you told us there was a labor shortage in 1980, 88, 89. You've had plenty of time to train Americans to do the job. Why would they care about the quality of public education if they think they can just keep bringing in these folks from overseas? So, I mean, and then when you get to the lower end of the economic, I know you've talked to a number of folks on this issue, so I don't want to repeat what they've already told you, but the data are clear here. When it comes to people with a high school degree or less, this massive inflow of people with less, education, a high school degree or less, fifth grade education, illiterate in any language. We're a post-industrial superpower information society. Last thing we need to be doing is bringing in people who are more appropriate for the age of the buggy whip and the Model T. We don't need this massive surfeit of unskilled labor, but we're bringing it in, either illegally or not. And then you wonder why wages have been stagnant and why American men, native-born American men, are all dropping out of the labor force. And they've been crowded out of everything. And these wages that they're paid under the table, the aliens, whatever, you can't survive on them. I mean, this stuff is like basic common sense, supply and demand. You keep increasing the supply, employers like it. They love it. And I'm sure in Florida, Governor DeSantis is doing a great job down there. He's got the legislature whipped into shape. But there's always going to be these businesses down in Florida going, oh, I got to raise wages, and, if you're a marginal employer. And the problem is if you're an employer who's trying to do the right thing, pay competitive wages, the guy who's using the illegal labor is going to be able to undercut you because he's shortchanging on the labor cost, right? It's called privatizing the profits of low-wage labor while you commonize the costs on the community for education, all that kind of stuff. So it's a complicated issue, but it's killing the job prospects for young people.
I guess I just don't understand how do the Democrats not, number one, see this as an act of slavery and not see what it is doing to our country, or how are they benefiting enough to make this a reality that could essentially ruin our country. Like, I don't understand that. And that's my, I'm not the high level thought process on the political side of it. So me being a regular American's like, I don't get it.
If you're willing to sacrifice the productivity for the, for the labor cost, I mean, if you give me 3 slaves and all I have to do is give them a room and 3 meals a day, I'll make money if they're at all productive. It's apparently a preferred alternative to automation, robotics, things like that. I mean, the best thing we could do for our economy would be to shut off the supply of less skilled labor for a sustained period of time. And we would see the introduction of all this labor saving technology right across the board, agriculture, all the way up to like home health care and everything else. But if the alternative is being able to bring people in who are willing to work all day for a bucket of fish heads, employers would prefer that. That's, this is part of the debate that went on 100 and some years ago, led to the very first immigration restrictions at the federal level, 1916, 1920, 1922. But those restrictions were hard fought. And the only reason that American business actually finally agreed to support the restrictions that brought down the huge Ellis Island wave was because of fear of the contagion from the Bolshevik Revolution, and evidence that too many of the immigrants who were coming in to work in the sweatshops were sympathetic to what was happening in Russia. Now, I don't know what it would take. I mean, maybe Trump's election vindicates the idea that some of these tech company gurus who've been so, adamant about foreign labor. I mean, Elon Musk is basically talking at 2 levels. He's talking one about if you don't give him his H-1B workers, he's going to kill you. But on the other hand, he's saying we're bringing in so many immigrants that it's destroying our civilization. So, I mean, it's you got to kind of thread the needle. But the point is, that's a tectonic shift in the tech company perception of this. And maybe they're beginning to realize that there is a level at which you can destabilize this wonderful American experiment. Remember, sorry about my cold. It used to be called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. That's what it was called, the INS, for decades. Immigration was the first step. Naturalization, oath of allegiance, that was the last. When you immigrate, you had to wait 5 years or so before you took the oath of allegiance. Now, what did you learn in that period of time? Well, what does it mean to live in a self-governing republic, a democracy? And what it means is you're not loyal to a potentate, a thug, a dictator, a tribal chief, a strong man, a murderer, whatever. You basically are a citizen in a self-governing democracy. You're an office holder as a citizen participating in that process, selecting your government, selecting your governor. And that's a big change from historically what was done, right? Kind of like the equivalent would be Adam Smith's invisible hand, that somehow things go better when people are able to do what they want to do instead of centrally directed conduct in a communist or fascist regime, right? So you're teaching them something about what it means to be an American, politically, historically, what have you. And ideally, you're teaching people about what market capitalism is and why it's an efficient, done properly, allocation of resources, right? If you don't teach people those fundamental lessons about what it means to be an American, you bring people in at a level where they're basically bringing bad ideas into the country to the point where, they're met here right off the boat by left-wing AOC types who are trying to convince them, the problem is or Bernie Sanders. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders. He hasn't changed his tune in 50 years. But he goes to find these young audiences who are still gullible enough to listen to his nonsense about, income inequality is somehow a bad thing because, some people work harder than others and some people have better capability or skills than others. But in any case, that process of molding people into being an American is the key to assimilation for large numbers of people. The level of immigration has to be guided by factors that include the assimilability, I think that's the right word, of the people coming in, the volume, the velocity, how fast they're coming in, and what they're meeting when they get here, right? Do we as a nation have the confidence to stand up for what we ultimately have, this great tradition, the glory of the English language, which is a fabulous creation, rich, diverse, from so many sources that came into Great Britain and came here, our sort of Anglo-American system of governance, understanding of property rights and its role in freedom and building a society, and all these things that go along with what makes democratic freedom possible in the allocation of political power and votes. Immigration tends to corrupt the process because some people make a lot of money off immigration. Jennifer, your question is really about why is it so hard to get right? Because immigration is about exploitation and about greed and about making money using marginal labor instead of innovation and productivity advances. And so, because in both sides of the spectrum, it serves certain people's interests, it becomes hard for our two-party system to find the center. Now, there used to be a center back in the 80s and 90s. As I said earlier, there was a political center. You had Rockefeller Republicans, but people who believed fundamentally in the rule of law, cultural conservatives who liked the stability of the American culture and in the cultural community. And then you had people who were big government liberals, Eugene McCarthy, Governor Dick Lamb, who understood that if you don't know how many people you're going to be serving in the country, you can't deliver good government services, right? You issue a bond, you build a school, but if the school's overcrowded suddenly because people have come in illegally and they put their kids in the school, our kids are getting hurt, right? I mean, think about what Biden did to public education, overloading our public schools, because the Supreme Court demanded in 1982 we provide education at taxpayer expense. They call it free public education, like something's free, right? Anyway, and the point is, and here you have unaccountable Supreme Court justices putting this mandate on taxpayers to provide education for anybody coming in putting 10 kids in public school. What do you think that did to public education, right? 1982, the Supreme Court, I think it was Potter. No, it was Brennan who wrote the decision. Oh, we don't see any economic burden of kids going into public schools. Well, that was 1982. You should look at it now. And that kind of unfunded mandate is part of the problem. And that's the last problem, which is that the state and local taxpayers are the ones who pay most of the cost for this uncontrolled immigration. At the federal level, you have lawyers and the Judiciary Committee, people like that who basically go, oh, yeah, we'll let another couple hundred million in. No problem. We'll let the state and local taxpayers deal with it. And, you have this disconnect. So, I mean, there are all these structural reasons why immigration policy is so hard to get solved. As Mark Krikorian, I think, may have said to you, there are winners and losers, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, right now, what Donald Trump has done is vindicate the interests of the populist wing of the Republican Party. He's basically kicked out the Bush entrenched, wing of the party, the elites, the country club guys, all those, and basically said the populist party, part of the party, is going to rule for a while. The Bush wing, they don't like that. They're upset. We heard them all the Never Trumpers. But, as I believe somebody said, who was it? Hear the people rule, right? And in the case of what we see with Donald Trump, that's what we're seeing. So maybe something will get done.
Well, you certainly have, packed a lot in there, as far as, housing and education. And the one thing that I don't know that you touched on is public health. And, what kind of impact does this have on our health systems? Like here in Sarasota, we have, a public supported hospital. And, a portion of our property taxes go to support that hospital and indigent care, which of course includes a lot of emergency room care for illegal immigrants. But, from your global or national perspective, what's that, this influx? I mean, we're not importing, nurses and doctors for the most part, or Biden didn't import nurses and doctors that came across the southern border. It's people who need nurses and doctors. So what are your thoughts, and what are you seeing from the national perspective on that?
Well, healthcare is one of the major costs: education, healthcare, housing. I mean, these are some of the major costs of immigration. The people who come in who are doctors, very small number percentage. We're talking about the overall immigration level. No, what the world is supplying is people who, as I say, are illiterate in any language and have fifth grade education, and they don't have health insurance, and naturally, there's a Hippocratic oath. Public institutions are supposed to try to help people, whether they can pay or not. But in the end, Barack Obama stood up at his State of the Union, and the Joe Thomas set up. Obama said, "Oh, illegal aliens are not going to get access to Obamacare," and Joe said, "You lie." It was a big scandal. Oh my God!
Yeah, right.
As if somehow the Democrats are models of decorum when it comes to Republicans giving a State of the Union. In any case, naturally, Biden just said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we're going to give illegal aliens Obamacare." And oh, by the way, and of course, Gavin Newsom struggling with a $2+ billion deficit in California is busy giving illegal aliens health care. I mean, when it goes beyond just the cost of health care, you also have this absurd interpretation of the 14th Amendment. A woman comes in El Paso Hospital 45 minutes before delivering a baby, and the baby's a U.S. citizen and entitled to the rights and privileges of a U.S. citizen. And of course, we're responsible for the health care of the citizen child too. So, this again is privatizing profits, commonizing costs. No way the framers of the 14th Amendment ever anticipated this kind of stuff going on. In 1867, most people didn't go more than 30 miles from their place of birth their entire lives.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't have birth certificates. Everybody knew who you were. You're either the town drunk or the sheriff. And, we have these antiquated ideas. And so, part of the healthcare cost is ultimately like some absurd number, like, 40% of mothers giving birth to children in our public hospitals are here illegally. We have birth tourism, same thing there. The cost of healthcare is already very high, and certainly trying to provide emergency public health care, which is mandated for all these people, is a massive burden on our healthcare system. Then you get into the problem of unvetted people coming into the country, resurgence of things like tuberculosis, right? We had COVID come in, we had lots of things like that, resurfacing of measles, things like that. We have polio is now back, unvetted. Are we supposed to, support the Chinese government and assuming that they're going to protect us from, Chinese visitors coming in? They did such a great job with COVID. My goodness. I mean, all kinds of reasons why you have to have strict vetting. And it's so funny that Biden would have let the borders get so bad out of control after having just gone through a pandemic.
Yeah, that seems crazy.
Can I ask a question, Jamie? I know.
Yeah, please.
So, and this is going to be a weird question, but what does it look like actually coming in through the border? Like, is it like a turnstile? Is it like a amusement park? Is it like customs? What does it look like?
Well, it's kind of like a line at Disney World in a way. I mean, you got to wait at the port of entry and you get screened by an officer. If you have a passport, he examines it.
Do they take pictures of everybody coming in?
No, I mean, they take biometrics of certain people who are non-citizens. Particularly if you come in and make a humanitarian claim for asylum or what have you, if you're released on recognizance and given an order to show cause, or an order to report on a certain date, they're doing biometric identification. The port of entries are relatively orderly, but they're overwhelmed. You go to the San Ysidro port of entry down there near San Diego, and see lines and lines of traffic most days as people wait in line to go through. In most cases, if you're a U.S. citizen, it's fairly obvious. They ask you a few questions and you wave you through. But if you're from another country, they inspect your passport. If you don't have proper documentation, they don't let you come in. If you try to make a humanitarian claim or you're in one of these crazy parole programs that Biden put over, they take down your information, take the biometric fingerprints, and maybe they believe you're a flight risk. They'll give you an ankle bracelet and send you on your way. Or if they think you're a flight risk, they'll put you in detention.
A flight risk to where?
But where?
Yeah, where would they be a flight risk to?
Well, I mean, if they're not going to show up for their court hearing,
okay,
but they've made an asylum claim. In fact, Congress has mandated asylum claimants be detained, but of course, administrations always claim they don't have the space. I mean, one of the reasons why the Trump administration is trying to send folks to Guantanamo, is they just, there's only so much detention space, and Biden did everything he could with Secretary Mayorkas. Guy ought to be tried for treason, for God's sake. Closed all these detention centers, and the Democrat states don't want private detention facilities in their states. I mean, you have to realize, Jennifer, that we're dealing with one entire political party that wants to sabotage all immigration enforcement. Once somebody gets into what you notice in this whole problem is that getting into the country is a lot easier than removing them. It's like all kinds of ways people can get into the country without inspection, overstay a visa, lie their way through a port of entry, fraud, whatever. But like the Democrats and their allies all know that the removal process requires this kind of immigration court proceeding. It's elaborate. Trump has tried to short circuit that with some folks with the Alien Act from 1797, 98. And, of course, he's getting blowback from some of the courts about using such an old law. But in the end, the procedural process that's due in a removal proceeding is cumbersome enough that takes, if you want to deport a million illegal aliens in 1 year, it's pretty hard to do with the court backlogs that we have now. And the court system itself is a whole different topic, set up because the advocates did not like the fact that hearing officers back in the 1980s were immigration officers that were part of the enforcement division. I mean, immigration's a civil matter. It's not a criminal matter. If you remove somebody back to the home country, you're not putting them in jail. You're sending them home. Very different. Chris Van Hollen is saying, oh, this guy we want to bring back from El Salvador is a Maryland man. Stephen Miller said, no, he's not a Maryland man. He's an El Salvadoran citizen. He doesn't belong here at all. But that's where the Democrats keep blurring citizenship and all these other statuses. Well, when you have one entire political party that opposes state and local cooperation, sheriffs, because they're elected officials, are one of the few local officers who are able to really speak out in opposition to the Democrats' opposition, if you will, to these state and local cooperation agreements with federal immigration authorities, which are critical to actually identifying and removing visa overstayers, people here illegally generally. The Democrats and their allies have put up these walls between the federal government and the state government, isolated the enforcement authorities at the federal level, and that's why there's no interior enforcement. And this has to be turned around. We're not going to be sustained as a country if we don't find a way to reinvigorate interior immigration law enforcement. And that's what Trump is desperately trying to do. And he's got some good folks there in Miller, Tom Homan, good friend, doing a really great job.
Well, and you mentioned, kind of your congressman, your senator, and, it's frustrating to me when we hear people use the term, long-term legal resident instead of green card holder, just crazy terminology to make them sound more legal and more permanent and more, like a citizen when they're simply not citizens. They're green card holders. We maybe allow them here, but it goes back to what you said at the beginning of the show, which is, hey, if you're here as a guest, act like a guest and you'll get treated like one. But if you're going to come down and, try to, exert your non-existent First Amendment right by burning down buildings, that's not acting like a guest. And you should be deported if you do that, if you're not a citizen. And quite frankly, the citizens who do that should be in jail. And, I just wrote a newsletter on Substack that went out this morning that was talking about Abrego Garcia and how convoluted the press has screwed up, John Roberts' order. And, and how they, John Roberts didn't mandate that we go get him and bring him back. They're like, he kind of shrugs a little bit and says, hey, do what you can, and keep the lower court updated, type of thing. And so, if I'm allowed to take a 2-page letter and turn it into 8 words, but, so it's a frustrating thing. I think we kind of covered most of the points we had, but we wanted to have just kind of a fun question. If you were talking to a group of high school students, college students, what do you think is the number one thing that those young people misunderstand about legal or illegal immigration?
Well, Immigration is ultimately about who we are, we the people. It's about who we are, who we become, what kind of nation we're going to be. A country should really do its own work. And in the end, if you allow the forces of greed and exploitation and power to take control of immigration policy, they will destroy not only your futures, but our national destiny. Immigration implicates every public concern you as a young person will ever be concerned about the rest of your life. It touches everything from entitlements, fiscal sanity, labor force equity, environmental concerns, pollution, resource usage, resource allocation, um, certainly issues like traffic congestion, housing availability, cultural cohesion, quality of education. It goes on and on and on.
Sure.
Immigration policy touches on everything you will be concerned about for the rest of your life. And therefore, you better go about the business of understanding who comes in, how many, and most importantly, how a nation like ours should enforce the rules.
And it looked like you were going to say something, Jennifer, but if you had a magic wand and you could make a law, or let's keep it to two laws, what do you think, what would be the magic wand you would wave and say, this fixes it?
If you don't play by the rules, you don't play the game.
Well, you made that simple. I like it. So
That's right, though. I mean, it's that simple.
yeah, it really is.
I
It's
mean, I
not.
think it's that simple. I just this is just amazing to me. Just all of this is crazy.
And we both have learned so much through this entire series. And you would be surprised, Dan, how much the four of you did not talk about the same topics.
Yeah.
It's complete. These were, because we kind of worried about it. It's like, oh, these could kind of run into being the very same show. And every show was so unique. And you all brought, every single one of you brought such a breadth of knowledge to our viewers and our listeners, that just incredible knowledge. I know that I like to think that I'm up to date on most things. Maybe an inch deep and a mile wide, but I've learned an incredible amount. You're sharing your knowledge today. Do you want to ask the final closing bonus closer question, Jennifer?
So let's say that nothing changes, right? It stays the way that it is. And what is the real risk to America if we keep doing what we're doing now?
That's an excellent question, Jennifer, because what we saw under Joe Biden exposes something that we have been concerned about from the very beginning of FAIR. And we're the granddaddy organization, and I am, of course, the best of the guests. And I know that's probably axiomatic. But the truth is, I'm just kidding. The truth is,
No, it's absolutely true. But we've said that to all of them.
yeah, thank you. I'll take it. The truth is, there's always been this concern that an unprincipled executive president would take advantage of the asymmetry in how the courts are willing to hear complaints on immigration by allowing in millions and millions of aliens without any legal authority. In other words, if the ACLU thinks that somebody's been wrongly excluded, like this clown from El Salvador, they can litigate it to the Supreme Court. But if Joe Biden lets in 2-3 million people here who have no right to be here, courts go, oh, you don't have any standing. You can't show direct injury.
Right.
And so the courts are basically almost silent about it. Well, we always knew that unless Congress steps up and closes these loopholes, which they've tried to do in so-called H.R. 2 from last Congress, and creates a standing provision, which they did do in the Lake and Riley bill, to allow Americans and states affected by improvidently admitted, illegally admitted aliens by an unprincipled president, they can go to court to stop it. And that has to happen. Congress has to do this, because otherwise, as you saw under Trump 1.0, the minute Biden comes in, he's reversing all these executive orders and all these good policies. So then all of a sudden, AOC gets elected president. I know, we're all going to Canada. And she just undoes everything and starts this nonsense again.
Sure.
So this is the great danger this country faces. An unprincipled president for partisan purposes, power politics, vote packing, whatever you want to call it, lets the borders get out of control on purpose, purely for vanity, partisan gain, whatever reason, and nobody can stop it. This is the great danger. We will cease to be a functioning nation. Everything we care about, that we like about this country, or used to like, will be gone, because no nation can sustain massive, uncontrolled immigration on an unending basis, because you know what? There's more of them than there are of us. Very simple.
So this just brings, because I'm a big conspiracy theory person, and
Oh no,
let's go to the auto pen. So
you're
if
on the
we get,
wrong side of Florida for this.
I know.
It's got to be
So,
over there around Port St. Lucie.
so we find out that the immigration, everything was signed by the auto pen, and then we maybe find out who was in charge of the auto pen one day. I mean, is that even possible?
Well, the auto pen was wielded by Barack Obama. Everybody knows that. I mean, contrary to the American tradition, Obama didn't leave Washington afterward and go back to, chop wood and cut bush or whatever. What did Reagan do on his ranch? Clear brush. Or like Harry Truman, go back and be a country lawyer. I mean,
George W. became a painter.
Painter and good friends with Michelle Obama, apparently. Let's hope Hunter Biden becomes a good painter too. But no, Obama stayed here and he said what he wanted. I mean, everybody knows this. I mean, he had his buddies and all this. He directed who the staff were. I mean, the beautiful thing about the whole thing was that Obama had this whole thing orchestrated. He directed the White House staff. He met with them all the time. Everybody knows what was going on here. Had a nice big mansion in Colorado, his nice place in Hawaii and his place in the vineyard. And that was great stuff. He had a good time. The only thing that went wrong was that Biden broke the deal. Biden was supposed to be a one-term president, and he turned around and went, hey, Jill and I, man, we're digging this, and basically our whole family's corrupt, and we want to make sure they don't get prosecuted. Joe needs another term. And Barack's like, hey, man, that wasn't the deal. It's like, hey, what are you going to do about it? Anyway, that blew up in his face. And that was the beauty of the whole thing. But yeah, it was clearly Obama and his apparatchik, Susan Rice, and all those crazies that were in the White House.
So no conspiracy at all, Jennifer, just Barack Obama.
Oh, that's a conspiracy in itself. So I'm going to stick with that.
Well, you're new to politics, Jennifer, but sooner or later you're gonna learn you're getting lied to every minute. So
Yeah.
the fact that the legacy media is desperately trying to hang on, using whatever techniques they are, I mean, it's kind of interesting to behold. I mean, I was actually trained years ago by a Pulitzer Prize winner with Newsday, which was really a great newspaper in Long Island for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
And, I remember when we used to be able to go on TV and have policy debates on different sides and people could make up their minds. And, that the big thing that's collapsed in our society is debate. I mean, the left doesn't want to debate. Then there's no debate. So I don't know why people would want to watch cable news, so-called news, because I find one-sided panels where everyone's agreeing with each other is boring and doesn't illuminate anything. They pitch these softball questions to their buddies, and of course they're working off talking points from either the White House or the Democrat, whatever. And it's like, this is not interesting at all. You want to hear a debate, a real debate by policy experts. The 4 or 5 people you had on immigration, every one of those folks, I know all of them, I'm sure, could have been, probably hired some of them and probably fired some of them, could have been, fabulous on a national debate stage. But you can ask every one of them, how many times have you been involved in a good forensic debate on immigration in the last 10 years? I think Mark Krikorian's been on a few, but very few. I mean, in the old days, it was like every week back in the 80s, 90s. So debate has disappeared. Terrible loss for the American people.
Well, it doesn't even seem like people can have conversations today about politics. And
you have to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. Exactly. What we need is reflection, not reflexes. We need honest, reasonable arguments. Okay.
Yes.
How about that?
That's right.
Honest.
Exactly.
And I appreciate the public service you all are doing.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything that we did not cover that you would like to say before we sign off?
No, out of respect for your time, I can talk about this for 3 days.
We
There's
have
almost
time.
nothing
If
about the
there's
topic I don't
honestly,
know.
if there's
Well,
something that, yeah,
and if you went for 3 days, you would beat Cory Booker's new filibuster record, right?
Yeah, I wonder if he had a tent like Edward Everett did at the Gettysburg Address, and I admire his bladder.
Yeah, I always say that ending a filibuster on April 1st may not have been your best timing. Like, who cared? Who cared? Jennifer, do you have any other questions?
I don't. I don't.
Dan, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your time and knowledge. It's been incredible. Thank you.
My pleasure. Anytime. Good luck.
Just hold still for 1 second and we'll be right back.
This has been Reasonable Arguments, News and Nonsense. There is so much BS on the mainstream media news, but you knew that. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. See you next time as husband and wife duo Jamie and Jennifer keep it real on Reasonable Arguments.